These are the 18 most mind-bending science conspiracies ever discussed on the Joe Rogan Experience. From mass hypnosis events disguised as public health policy, to time-warping equations that might already be in use by classified research programs. This list takes you deep into the parts of science you were never supposed to question. Over the years, Joe has interviewed maverick inventors, whistleblowing researchers, and rogue scientists, each bringing theories that sound impossible until they start making sense. This is the Joe Rogan Science Conspiracy Iceberg, where each layer gets more dangerous, more technical, and more real. Starting with Terrence Howard's Math Rebellion. In episode number 1791, Joe Rogan sat down with Eric Weinstein and Terrence Howard, yes, the actor from Empire, to discuss what might be the wildest math theory ever aired on the show. Terrence believes 1 times 1 equals 2, not metaphorically, literally. And what follows is a mind-bending breakdown of how he arrived at that conclusion and why he thinks mainstream math is rigged to suppress it.
When I say 1 times 1 equals 2, that's a metaphor for challenging the status quo. Despite the fact that the square root of 2 has all of its issues when you cube it or you multiply it by 2, which creates a contradiction, despite the fact that the square root of 2 has a problem with the prime numbers.
This idea hinges on something called non-standard arithmetic, where math is treated more like a philosophical construct than a rigid truth. It's not unheard of. Some fringe mathematicians have proposed alternate systems where operations like multiplication are redefined to better reflect natural processes. That said, redefining multiplication has massive consequences. It breaks algebra as we know it.
The fact that they call number 2 a prime number when it's clearly a composite number. Any other prime number, and I'll jump into this, any prime number that you subtract from another prime number, you always get a composite number, except with the situation of the number 2. And there's so many people and that's why the prime numbers are unpredictable, because of that problem.
Mathematically, 2 is a prime number because it has exactly 2 distinct positive divisors, 1 and itself. But Howard challenges this by looking at how subtraction behaves across primes, an operation unrelated to the formal definition. His objection is more about perceived symmetry than the actual number theory. Still, he's not wrong that 2 behaves weirdly. It's the only even prime and causes issues in some branches of advanced math.
2 is different. I mean, you will find that mathematicians will often talk about proving something for characteristic not equal to 2. So they'll single out 2 as being just very, very different. So look that up when we're done.
Yeah,
Weinstein's reference to characteristic not equal to 2 is key. In algebraic structures like fields, setting the characteristic to 2 can cause rules like a plus a equals 0 to become true, which can destroy standard logic. So yes, in very high-level math, the number 2 is often excluded to keep structures well behaved.
In other words, I have the opportunity to strawman you if I want to, because what you just said sounded crazy. And I also have the possibility to steelman you. So all the algebraic topologists who just heard, for characteristic not equals to 2, they're like saying, yeah, that's fair.
What Weinstein is doing here is rare on the show, steel manning. Rather than mock Howard's position, he reframes it in a way that advanced mathematicians might respect. By invoking algebraic topology, he's suggesting that under the right lens, especially abstract lenses, Howard's confusion could actually resemble a deep philosophical tension that has troubled math for centuries. And if challenging the laws of mathematics sounds wild, just wait until someone tells you gravity isn't a force you fight, it's something you can turn off. Let's talk Bob Lazar, the UFO that breaks physics. In episode number 1315, Joe Rogan sat down with Bob Lazar, the man who claims he worked on reverse engineering alien spacecraft at a secret facility near Area 51. But according to Bob, these crafts bent gravity itself. And once you understand how it supposedly worked, you'll never look at physics the same way again.
There was talk of weapon systems, that there were different projects. Project Galileo, Project Sidekick was supposed to be weapon applications of the craft. Project Looking Glass had to do with time, any effects of time in the craft. Now, I don't think, we're not talking about making a time machine like in science fiction, but we're talking about, small distortions, intentional distortions of time, and how that can be used, as a not as a well, it was part of a weapon program.
How are you informed in this? About
These again were just the small briefings that I read, but again, I don't really like to talk about those because I don't have any information on them, and it was just small briefings.
This is a rare glimpse into how compartmentalized these projects really are. Lazar wasn't actually part of Looking Glass or Sidekick. He was only shown just enough to stay functional, but not enough to understand the full picture. That structure is common in Black Ops. As for distortions of time, the U.S. military has openly funded research into time perception, latency, and temporal effects in extreme environments. It's not time travel, but it could be how these crafts predict movement, anticipate threats, or even create micro-lags in enemy response.
What Commander Fravor saw as he was in the F-18 approaching it, he described it as a ping pong ball in a cup and shaking it back and forth. It was moving that fast. Now, obviously, if there's anything inside there, it's going to be battered to hell. But, my point was that, well, one of two things. Either there's a gravitational envelope in there which negates any inertia effects, or you are seeing through a gravity distortion field. So, just like you're looking at a hot highway and you see,
Looks like
an
water.
optical distortion going through there. Well, the same thing happens in gravity, and the craft may not actually be moving like that. It may just look like it because you can only see it through the field. So it may be making much more gentle moves.
Fravor's tic-tac footage became the gold standard for verified UFO sightings, but what Lazar suggests here reframes it entirely. If the craft is inside a gravity bubble, it wouldn't experience G-forces. And if it's projecting a distortion field, what pilots are seeing could be a visual illusion, like a heat mirage. NASA has acknowledged gravitational lensing in astronomy, but Lazar's claim is essentially that these crafts create that lens locally, on demand. That alone would require energy densities near what we associate with black holes.
The thing shows up 60 miles away. They noticed it on radar 60 seconds after it left Commander Fravor, but it was at his cap point, which is the next point he was destined to go to, 60 miles away. And in 60 seconds on radar, the same object ends up there.
So it's going a mile a second.
No, I think the radar just picked it up in 60 seconds.
Yeah, it could have been there instantly, but
We don't know.
the cycle time.
Nobody
on the radio
knows.
was 60
That's the whole thing. Is,
So it cycles, like radar cycles? Like
yeah,
sends
it
out a
doesn't.
beam
It doesn't sweep, but
Right,
I
it's
mean,
like
it
it turn- like-
scans.
yeah, like
it's a
that
planar
antenna.
array, so it
Okay.
just it scans around at random places.
That's the spy one does the really cool. Yeah, it
Right.
doesn't do the whole loop anymore.
Right. The point is though that the craft moved to his next location before he knew where his next location was going to be.
This is one of the most disturbing elements of the whole tic-tac event. The object was fast, sure, but on top of that, it anticipated movement. Lazar's implication is clear. It might be aware of us in ways we don't understand. That opens the door to theories involving predictive algorithms, shared consciousness networks, or even temporal feedback loops. And that would make these crafts not just alien in origin, but alien in thought.
These things were not really connected.
No, nothing is connected. There's no wiring at all.
That freaks me the f*** out.
Charge your iPhone,
Yeah. Well, wireless.
on the little, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a
Well, I
simple
mean,
electromagnetic. Yeah, I know again, but that's just simple electromagnetic induction.
Right, but I mean, Tesla, the scientist, had this concept of
Right, that's
what he's-
yeah.
That's what I'm talking
I mean,
about.
for other
Yeah.
people that don't know what we're saying, that he wanted to send wireless electricity through the sky, and Westinghouse was like, "Get the f- out of here with that." Like when anybody could just pull electricity.
Tesla's wireless energy experiments in Colorado Springs were real. He demonstrated long-range power transfer using tuned resonance coils, but it terrified industrialists like Westinghouse because it couldn't be monetized or controlled. Lazar's comment about the UFO having no wires at all is staggering. It suggests an entire system running on spatially distributed energy, something we're only beginning to explore now in things like wireless power transfer for drones and space stations.
Oh, we probably wouldn't have computers.
You think?
Yeah, I'm pretty positive.
Why
I
is
mean,
that?
forget about microelectronics. Well, this is dumping huge amounts of electromagnetic energy in the air, and yeah, we'd be able to wirelessly turn on our lights, but There'd be no radio communication. The interference would be something would be overwhelming. It would induce electric currents in anything with a small wire on it. So integrated circuits, transistors would be disintegrated before they were even, tested for operation.
Tesla's system might have wiped out the ability to build sensitive electronics. High-resonance EM fields could cook circuit boards. That means Earth's technological path, radio, chips, silicon, wasn't inevitable. It was a byproduct of what our infrastructure allowed. If another civilization started with something like element 115, their world might have skipped over electricity entirely and gone straight into field physics.
The only thing he saw in the craft, if we were considering Bob's story, the only thing that he saw in the craft that he related to, that looked like a human could make, was this honeycomb hatch. And I always love that because you're like obsessed with this thing that you could recognize.
I only focus on that because it was the one thing that I understood how it worked.
What was it?
And it was the access to the level below, and it was, if you take, you have a 6-pack of beer, and you take out the cardboard dividers, set it on the table, you can put a lot of pressure on the top. But if you push it from the sides, it collapses flat. So it was something like that in a honeycomb shape that was essentially some sort of sheet metal, and you could walk on that in the upper layer, but if you took the corner, stuck your finger in, and pushed, it collapsed and made an entryway.
This hatch is smart engineering. The honeycomb structure is used in modern aerospace for its strength-to-weight ratio, but the collapsible mechanism Bob describes implies a reactive material, one that responds to touch, pressure, or field signals. No motors, no hinges, just responsive geometry. If real, it's more akin to biological tissue than mechanical parts, echoing theories that these crafts are grown, not built.
Was there any discussion about the materials that were used to make the craft?
I'm sure there was, but that was the metallurgy division. It had nothing to do with us.
So you never got
not even the slightest briefing. I don't even know if it was metal or it was ceramic. I think there's a fine line between the two.
The fact that Lazar couldn't even identify the material type is revealing. Advanced ceramics, metal foams, and composite metamaterials can behave unlike anything we currently use. Today's aerospace alloys aren't even pure metals. They're layered composites. If the material used in these crafts falls outside known periodic behavior, it would explain why it was sealed off to other divisions. If Bob Lazar shattered our understanding of physics, Bart Sibrel came to shatter something even more sacred, American history itself. Because what if we never left Earth at all? Did we fake the moon landing? In episode number 1361, Joe Rogan sits down with filmmaker Bart Sibrel, the man who once got punched in the face by Buzz Aldrin, for what might be the most contentious conspiracy in American history. According to Sibrel, we never went to the moon. And he's not talking blurry footage. He brings out physics equations, funding trails, and timing problems that make the official story look a lot more fragile than NASA would like to admit.
This is the one. He hops by, and as he hops by, the breeze makes the flag blow.
Because he's in an air environment. He's not on the moon.
Right. That is a weird one. Do it again. Look at this. As he hops by, he doesn't touch the flag.
The reason why it's doing that, and really on the moon, is because there's micrometeorites hitting him, and they're bouncing off of him and hitting the flag.
What?
Is that a pretty good one?
Is that real?
No, I just...
Oh, I thought they were trying that one.
I was trying to come up with an excuse as to why the moon landings are real.
This clip gets to the heart of why the flag footage has always been a visual red flag for skeptics. NASA's explanation is that the flag moved because of inertia, not wind. But in this shot, the flag ripples as the astronaut passes, which Sibrel insists would require air. It's been hotly debated. Some say it's the momentum from the pole twisting. Others call it a dead giveaway of a studio set. NASA maintains the motion came from vibration, not atmosphere, but there's still no universally accepted answer.
Von Braun, we found publications of his. Mind you, my film cost $1 million. It was financed by a board member of an aerospace company who builds rockets for NASA, who knows it's fake, who gave me $1 million to produce these films as his patriotic duty to expose it. We found documentation from Von Braun that says every 24 hours on the moon, there's a 50% chance of a catastrophic, deadly error because of decompression from a micrometeorite. So they were there 3 days. They were 150% chance they would have been killed.
Wernher von Braun, often called the father of NASA's rocket program, was known for issuing brutal technical assessments. Sibrel references an early-era calculation from von Braun, warning about lethal exposure to micrometeorites on the moon. That number has been debated, but what's not in dispute is that the moon has no atmosphere to burn off debris. In reality, astronauts were at some risk, but a 50% daily death probability is heavily disputed by engineers who later improved shielding models. Still, the point holds. If the danger was that extreme, why risk sending humans there first?
He also said in writing, in order to go to the moon in one rocket, he says that cannot happen. You need 3 rockets, each being 10 times the tonnage of the Queen Mary, or some 800,000 tons each, in order to go to the moon. And the Saturn V was 2,500 tons, not 800,000 tons. We have that in writing.
That was from his book, right? And
That's
what year
right.
was that?
In 1959, and then he recanted on his math shortly thereafter by 30,000%. And now Elon Musk wants to, quote, return to the moon. And he says to return to the moon, we need to make 9 fuel trips first to ferry the fuel necessary to be able to go to the moon from there. That's exactly what von Braun said.
This is one of Sibrel's strongest parallels. He's not just quoting ancient textbooks. He's comparing von Braun's 1959 estimates with Elon Musk's current logistical plans for moon missions. The discrepancy in tonnage is massive, and Musk's need for fuel trips suggests the original Apollo missions defied fuel mass constraints we still struggle with today. NASA's rebuttal is that von Braun's early estimates were based on outdated engine performance models. But the physics question lingers. How did we supposedly do, in 1969, what we now need 9 launches to prepare for?
One of my favorite films is the film of the lunar module leaving the moon.
I think you're talking about where the camera perfectly
Pans.
tilts up
Yeah.
with the little model going up.
Yes.
And of course, with the delay, how could you synchronize that? With the remote control from NASA with the radio delay, that I suspect would be more like 12 seconds.
But also,
Because today, if you say to someone in Atlanta talking to someone in Iraq, hey, how's it going? 1, 2, 3. Hey, I'm doing fine. That's just on
Yeah, you can
halfway
put a
around the
timer.
world.
This camera shot has haunted skeptics for years. NASA's explanation is that the rover camera was pre-programmed to tilt upward at launch. Sibrel argues that any delay, even by a second, should have made the shot impossible. Technical papers confirm that earlier missions failed to capture the ascent due to tilt malfunctions and poor placement. Apollo 17 finally got it right. Was it skill or stage direction? NASA defenders say timing the pan was like cueing a camera shutter. Critics argue it was too perfect for 1972 tech.
NASA destroyed all the schematics, all the electronics, all the diagrams of the equipment, because you could later prove that the lunar module, they claimed that the lunar module was powering air conditioning on a bank of car batteries and competed against 250 degrees outside and got it down to a comfortable 72 for 3 or 4 days.
my
That's right.
Tesla only goes 350 miles.
They're saying they powered air conditioning off much more primitive batteries.
The air conditioning claim is one of Sibrel's more relatable points. The lunar module's power source was a bank of silver-zinc batteries. Modern engineers admit it's hard to grasp how such small energy reserves could regulate internal temperature for days. NASA insists it worked through passive thermal control and efficient systems, but none of the original testing data survives. The fact that NASA lost or destroyed much of its Apollo-era records, including telemetry tapes, remains an admitted and baffling failure.
Ron Howard, he wanted to make an IMAX movie. He went to NASA, said, give me all the originals so I can transfer it to HD, and project it at 120 feet wide. They said, give us a couple of days. And in those days, they lost every single original videotape from every single Apollo mission.
This actually happened. In 2006, NASA admitted the original Apollo 11 tapes were gone, taped over during a data shortage. While backups existed, the loss of historic footage infuriated historians and led to several conspiracy theories. NASA's defense? Bureaucratic error. But as Sibrel argues, If you spent billions achieving something world-changing, why would you erase it? Intentional or not, it's one of the most suspicious oversights in scientific history. So maybe we didn't make it to the moon. But what if we've already lost a civilization more advanced, in a completely different way, than we are today? If Bart Sibrel believes we faked our greatest leap forward, Graham Hancock thinks we've forgotten our greatest fall. The civilization that time erased. In episode number 1284, Joe Rogan is joined by Graham Hancock, who spent decades arguing that we're a species with amnesia, not because of what we've done, but because of what we've forgotten. According to Hancock, the true origin of civilization doesn't begin in Mesopotamia. It ends there. What came before, he says, was something radically different, an Ice Age culture that used altered states of consciousness, not machines, to build wonders that still defy modern explanation.
The fundamental thing is we as adult human beings need to take responsibility for our own lives and our own decisions. And we need not hand that responsibility over to governmental institutions, especially when it concerns something as intimate and personal as our consciousness. And my view is the ancient world had the right attitude to this kind of thing, and the modern world does not, and that we can sit down and learn a lot from the ancient world.
Hancock's critique of modern society is about mindset. Ancient societies may have treated consciousness exploration as a form of learning or initiation, not escapism. From Eleusinian rites in Greece to ayahuasca ceremonies in the Amazon, altered states were once embedded in social and spiritual life. Today, they're criminalized. That shift, Hancock argues, disconnects us from what may have once been a valid way of accessing knowledge.
A lot of people ask me, you know, Hancock, you've been arguing that there's been a lost civilization in the human story, but what sort of civilization do you think it was? Well, one of the things I think is it was a civilization that used psychedelics. I think it was a civilization that emerged from shamanism, but did not stay at the hunter-gatherer stage, but that took the essence of shamanism and integrated it into a very different kind of civilization from our own, which pursued things in different ways.
This idea flips the usual narrative that progress means more metal, more tools, more concrete. Hancock envisions a society that advanced inward rather than outward, prioritizing mental capacity over mechanical dominance. Archaeological evidence of this kind of soft civilization would be hard to find. No skyscrapers, no plastic. But that doesn't mean it didn't exist. Instead, we might be overlooking cognitive or spiritual technologies that were just as advanced in their own way.
The specific example I give is above the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid are 5 further chambers. And these chambers are roofed and floored with granite beams that weigh about 70 tons each. And there are hundreds of them. These 70-ton granite beams have been elevated to a height of more than 350 feet above the ground and carefully and precisely placed in position.
The beams are real, and they're huge. Modern cranes can lift 70 tons, but aligning dozens of them precisely over a fragile chamber without modern materials or machinery is still a logistics nightmare. No ancient Egyptian text explains how it was done. The standard ramp theory faces massive friction, weight, and scale problems. Hancock uses this as a wedge, not to prove aliens, but to argue we're missing something essential about ancient engineering.
It is very hard for archaeologists to explain how that was done using purely leverage and mechanical advantage. You can say, oh, perhaps they built a ramp and hauled the stones up the ramp. But then you have to confront basic laws of physics. You can't haul a stone weighing tens of tons up a slope that exceeds 10 degrees. Then you start doing the calculation. How long a ramp do I need with a 10-degree slope to get to 350 feet above the ground? And the answer is you need a long ramp.
The calculations back this up. To stay under 10 degrees, the ramp would need to be over a mile long, more massive than the pyramid itself. That structure would have left massive archaeological evidence. And it hasn't. Hancock's point isn't that it's impossible with ramps, but that mainstream theories only make sense if you ignore math. That's what he finds suspicious. Not what's been said, but what's been left out.
The idea that is foisted on us by archaeology may be the idea that they regard as absurd, namely that psychic powers were cultivated by ancient civilizations, that they could use powers of the human mind that we have allowed to lapse. Maybe that idea deserves further consideration. We have gone down a path of leverage and mechanical advantage. Science regards consciousness as local to the brain and doesn't see how it can exert itself outside of that. But maybe we should open up to those possibilities, that we're dealing with a very different kind of culture that used techniques that we have allowed to lapse.
It sounds far-fetched until you realize science still has no working definition of consciousness. Telekinesis and PSI phenomena have been studied under government projects like Stargate and SRY's remote viewing program. Most were inconclusive, but not disproven. Hancock's suggestion is less magic and more lost skill set, a form of high-level biofeedback or cognition we no longer access because we don't train it.
It's almost like what they had done was leave behind something that was so stupendous, so monstrously impressive, that it would transcend time.
Yeah.
And that you would have to look at it even thousands and thousands of years later and say, hey, like this defies conventional explanation.
They do.
They conveniently neglect a lot of those massive stones.
Yeah.
There's something poetic in this. Hancock sees the Great Pyramid not just as a tomb or power plant, but as a message across millennia, something too large to ignore and too precise to dismiss. Its very existence is the evidence. If it wasn't meant to be practical, maybe it was meant to last.
I think right now where I'd go is 12,800 years ago in the beginning of the Younger Dryas.
Just to see.
Because I think that's where the whole human story changes. I think that's where we change tracks from one path to another path. And following those cataclysmic events of the Younger Dryas between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago, following those, the signs of civilization that we see emerging are not the beginnings of civilization. They're a restarting.
The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has gained momentum in recent years. Geological evidence shows widespread fires, rapid climate change, and mass extinctions. Hancock argues that what we call the beginning of civilization was actually humanity rebooting after a near-extinction event. That explains why things like Göbekli Tepe show up fully formed, rather than developing slowly.
There are three places in the world which are really lacking in the investigation right now. One of them is the Amazon, 5.5 million square kilometers, very little archaeology done. Another is the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert, tough place to work. I can understand why there's little archaeology done there, but the Sahara Desert was green during the Ice Age. Then under the continental shelves, because sea level rose 400 feet. These are three domains that archaeology has largely not investigated, and it has largely not done so. They say, well, why would we spend the money on marine archaeology? It's much better to spend it on looking for shipwrecks rather than looking for signs of a lost civilization, because we archaeologists know there was no lost civilization.
This is the cornerstone of Hancock's critique. Archaeology doesn't look where it believes nothing exists. But the Amazon has already begun revealing massive geometric structures via LiDAR. The Sahara was once lush, and 400 feet of sea level rise would hide any coastal civilization, especially one that built from wood, not stone. Hancock's point is less about mystery and more about blind spots. He's not saying Atlantis is guaranteed. He's saying we've barely checked. If Hancock wants us to wake up to the past, Bravo wants us to realize we never even knew the present. The everything is fake philosophy. In episode number 948, The Joe Rogan Experience, Eddie Bravo took conspiracy thinking to its ultimate conclusion. Everything is staged. Governments, science, space programs, even the Earth itself, are part of a tightly scripted illusion. For Bravo, it all began with a single realization as a child. If not everyone was Catholic, how could he trust anything he'd been told?
I think maybe...
Is this a double negative?
I think
double cross?
They're testing missiles?
Did you see that?
Yeah, did you see that?
Is it for real?
It
Have
blew
you
up.
seen the parade? Show the clip of the parade
Yeah.
where they show them, like the soldiers marching in a
stepping.
parade, and then
They're
they're
flexing on us.
and then they're
Okay.
bringing out the missiles. I think they're all buddies. I think at the very top, the top of Russia, the top of the United States, the UK, they're just putting on a show, and he's designated villain when we need to distract people from this or that. And Kim Jong-un
But he's killed a lot of people.
testing missiles.
This goes beyond geopolitics and into theatrical theory. Bravo paints world affairs as scripted roles, an idea often called global theater. The designated villain trope echoes how intelligence agencies sometimes inflate threats to justify military budgets. While this kind of distrust isn't new, Bravo's take skips over real power struggles in favor of an all-or-nothing narrative. No enemies, only actors.
Wouldn't it be more likely that these poor people are just brainwashed? Because we know people get brainwashed. Wouldn't it be more likely that this is like the craziest?
When you take into consideration all the lies that we've been told, the faked moon missions, all this nothing. I mean, this is nothing. They put together a bunch of people and made a parade. They faked the moon mission 6 times. And everybody believes that.
But
I'm not saying they're actors. I'm just saying there's something fishy about the whole North Korea thing.
Bravo's logic here is consistent with conspiratorial stacking. Once one deception is accepted, others become easier to believe. The moon landing becomes the gateway. If that was fake, why not assume entire nations are staging their existence? The risk in this thinking is scope creep. Real manipulation exists, but lumping it with far-fetched claims weakens the credibility of valid critiques.
Dinosaurs real or not?
I don't trust that.
Yeah.
Tyrannosaurus Rex is a giant kangaroo. That's what it is. That's my guess. Look at it. It looks exactly the same. It's got a tail, hops around on 2 legs. They found a giant kangaroo, and when they figured it out, they go, dude, it's a kangaroo. They're like, shut the f*** up.
This isn't just anti-science. It's suspicion of categorization itself. Bravo suggests paleontology is more interpretive than factual, which in a limited sense is true. Fossil reconstructions involve educated guesses, but calling T-Rex a kangaroo disregards carbon dating, fossil structure, and comparative anatomy. Still, it taps into a deeper cultural cynicism. That expertise is often mistaken, or worse, invented.
Joe first brought it up like about a year and a half ago. How dumb do you have to be to think the world is flat? You brought it up again, like maybe 6 months later, and I said on your podcast, I said, that is so dumb. That's got to be some kind of CIA psyop. I was trying to debunk it.
Bravo doesn't fully endorse flat Earth. He treats it like a thought experiment. But he also implies it might be reverse psychology propaganda. This mirrors tactics in intelligence history, creating absurdity to discredit fringe truths. His argument isn't that Earth is flat. It's that belief systems are so compromised, we can't know what shape Earth really is.
There's a Japanese satellite that takes a photo from 22,000
Those are
miles
the
out
worst
every 10
pictures
minutes.
I can't believe you believe those pictures.
Do you remember when you had a flip phone?
Looks fake to me.
Do you
What
remember,
would convince you, though?
When I
Hold on
watch
a second.
Avatar,
When
I
you
don't need to be an
watch-
expert to know it's
you went
fake.
to the
When I watch
movies,
Avatar,
Eddie.
I'm not an
Avatar's-
expert. It's fake.
Avatar.
Bravo's position here reflects image distrust culture. Digital tools like CGI and deepfakes have blurred the line between evidence and fabrication. For him, authenticity isn't about credentials. It's about visual gut check. This challenges scientific communication in the 21st century. If the public can't trust images, even legitimate ones lose value.
Why do you always go towards the conspiracy?
It's a global thing.
So what do you think's going on up there?
I think all governments, most of them, the globalists, they're all working together. You put them on a ball. My guess is you're on a ball, you're nowhere. Don't try to go anywhere. Just stay there and work.
This is the heart of Bravo's worldview: control through perception. He frames the ball Earth as psychological confinement, a metaphor for existential powerlessness. Whether or not he believes it's literally flat is secondary. The idea is that space, borders, and even identity are manipulated to keep the population mentally grounded and economically productive.
You know who pays for satellites? The taxpayer. They get bills. We need a new telecommunications satellite. We got to throw it up there.
So you don't
we
think-
need $35 million.
You don't think
and they go,
satellites-
yeah, okay, we're going to sign it. They get the money. It's a tax scam.
You don't think satellites are real?
I don't think so.
Skepticism of satellite tech goes back decades, especially among flat Earth circles. But Bravo links it to financial fraud. Satellites as government grants, not actual objects. This merges techno-skepticism with economic populism, suggesting that the public is subsidizing illusions under the guise of innovation.
You said the space shuttle went into orbit. You know,
I knew it. I know it took off. Saw
Right.
that.
Okay.
And then I see it landing. You see that?
Right. You know
I don't
it
know
went-
where it went.
This type of uncertainty is central to Bravo's logic. He rarely claims to know the truth. He claims not to trust the official version. In doing so, he builds a worldview that thrives on ambiguity. The less he knows, the more power the lie must hold.
You need a T-shirt
Yeah.
that says everything is conspiracy. You'll make Alex Jones look like fucking like Gandhi. The
Alex Jones
ultimate
is like a blue belt
show.
conspiracy theorist.
Where Jones traffics in hyper-specific, often political conspiracies, Bravo operates in cosmic absurdity. His targets aren't institutions, they're realities. He doesn't want to overthrow the system. He wants to ask, what if the system was never real to begin with? The mass hypnosis framework. In episode number 1757, Joe Rogan interviews Dr. Robert Malone, one of the original pioneers of mRNA vaccine technology, who now claims that mass psychology, not medicine, is what really took over the world during COVID. Malone lays out a chilling theory that society didn't just overreact, it was hypnotized. And once you hear how he explains it, the pandemic might start looking less like a crisis and more like a trance.
Brett ends with basically the question, if you listen to the long version, of how does this happen? The how question of a third of the population basically being hypnotized and totally wrapped up in whatever Tony Fauci and the mainstream media feeds them, whatever CNN tells them is true.
The term mass formation psychosis has been heavily debated, but the psychological pattern Malone describes does have roots in European crowd psychology from the early 20th century. Researchers like Gustave Le Bon and later Hannah Arendt described similar collective behaviors, where anxiety and confusion prime the public to follow simplified narratives without scrutiny. The difference, they didn't tie it to nightly cable news or health mandates.
Let me illustrate that. The other day I was looking through New York Times recent articles about Omicron and pediatrics in preparation for this and for making some slideshows. And I saw this headline in the New York Times, epidemiologist and a vaccinologist, and the title was, How You Should Think About Children and Omicron. It was blatantly saying, this is how you should think.
While editorial headlines often aim to guide public interpretation, Malone draws attention to the subtle line between informing and programming. His concern isn't just the message, it's the structure, telling readers how to think. This mirrors techniques used in persuasion and propaganda studies, where declarative framing replaces exploration with instruction.
What Matthias Desmet has shared with us, brilliant insight, is another one of those, aha, now that part makes sense, which is that this comes from basically European intellectual inquiry into what the heck happened in Germany in the 20s and 30s. You know, very intelligent, highly educated population, and they went barking mad. And how did that happen? The answer is mass formation psychosis.
Desmet's theory intentionally echoes the Frankfurt School and post-war psychoanalysis, both of which tried to explain why ordinary people embraced authoritarianism. But linking 1930s Germany directly to 2020's lockdown culture is a leap. Critics argue it's an oversimplification of two radically different societies, but Malone uses it to illustrate how manipulation isn't about intelligence, it's about emotion.
When you have a society that has become decoupled from each other and has free-floating anxiety and a sense that things don't make sense, we can't understand it, and then their attention gets focused by a leader or a series of events on one small point, just like hypnosis, they literally become hypnotized and can be led anywhere.
This mirrors the psychology of cult dynamics and mob behavior. Isolate individuals, induce stress, then offer a singular solution. Whether or not COVID-era policies qualify as hypnosis, the broader concern is valid. Emotional overwhelm often leads people to embrace rigid ideologies, even if they contradict previous beliefs.
We had all those conditions. If you remember back before 2019, everybody was complaining, the world doesn't make sense, blah, blah, blah. And we're all isolated from each other. We're all on our little tools. We're not connected socially anymore, except through social media. And then this thing happened and everybody focused on it. That is how mass formation psychosis happens, and that is what's happened here.
This framing shifts COVID from a biological crisis to a psychological one. Malone sees the virus as a catalyst, not a cause. It's the response that worries him, the unthinking unity, the loss of skepticism. Whether this stems from psychosis or panic is up for debate, but the crowd response to early COVID measures, like panic buying and sudden social dogma, does suggest a collective mental shift.
Matthias' recommendation is you got to get people to realize that what we've got is a situation of global totalitarianism. In his experience in Europe, making people realize there's a bigger threat than the virus can cause a separation psychologically in this fusion, this hypnosis that has happened. The problem is, then you're just substituting a bigger boogeyman from the current one. And somebody else can come in and manipulate that.
Malone isn't just warning about state overreach. He's warning about the vacuum it creates. Replace one fear with another, and you risk feeding the same cycle. This is the trap of resistance movements. Once you define your identity around rejecting one narrative, you can become vulnerable to new ones dressed in rebellion.
And one of the things we have to do is come together. We have to recreate our social bonds. We have to buy into integrity, the importance of human dignity, and the importance of community. That's how we get out of this.
The call for community echoes post-crisis strategies seen after world wars or civil unrest. Re-establish trust, decentralize control, and prioritize local human connection. It's more philosophical than procedural, but intentionally so.
We got a world in which the press is incentivized to push a storyline because they're all controlled by the same large funds that Pfizer is, and so is tech.
While it's true that pharmaceutical advertising is a dominant revenue stream for major outlets, the idea of a coordinated media pharma-tech triad strays into territory with less tangible evidence. Still, it reflects public distrust after years of shifting health advice and conflicting messages.
Mass formation psychosis that we're currently experiencing. Most people are unaware that's even happening. All these events take place, and it's this perfect storm of the social media aspect of it, the fact that we are disconnected, the COVID, the separation, the isolation from society, the lockdowns, where we're so polarized.
This perfect storm framing captures the chaotic convergence of 2020 to 2021. Emotional, political, digital, and biological forces all hit at once. Even if you reject the psychosis label, Malone's timeline offers a plausible map of how societies became more tribal, reactive, and volatile in just a few years.
People want me to get vaccinated. And like my friends who've been vaccinated want me to join the team. Like, go ahead, get the tattoo. Like, what are you saying? I've gone through the virus. I have immunity. I also have antibodies. I just checked them last week. They want me to join.
But what if that programming wasn't just social? What if it was genetic? The ancient genetic engineering theory. In episode number 2160, Joe Rogan dives into ancient texts, cosmic blueprints, and the possibility that human beings were designed, not by nature, but by visitors. Billy Carson brings forward a theory rooted in Sumerian tablets and cuneiform records that a race of advanced beings, called the Anunnaki, genetically engineered humans as a labor force. These weren't just myths, they were manuals.
Specifically talking about these ancient tablets, which are, to me, some of the most interesting things about ancient history. Particularly what came out of ancient Sumer.
Yeah.
Ancient Sumer, when you look at their tablets and like, what are they saying? And why would they dedicate so much time to talking about this stuff?
Exactly.
Why do they have pictures of giant, enormous people-looking things with like a humanoid with a tail sitting on their lap? How do they have a representation of the solar system with the correct amount of planets and relatively the correct order and size? And how the hell, 6,000, 5,000 years ago, do they know that?
The Sumerians' depiction of the solar system, with planets that couldn't be seen by the naked eye, has long fueled ancient astronaut theories. While some scholars argue the alignment was symbolic, the accuracy still puzzles researchers. Uranus and Neptune weren't officially discovered until the 1700s and 1800s. Carson suggests that the Sumerians didn't just guess, they remembered.
The conventional explanation is always going to the term mythology. They throw mythology around, left and right to cover up the fact that they have no clue or idea, so they turn it into mythology so they can kind of say it's all fantasy and fairy tales, and this is how they expressed themselves or how they understood the universe. It's all mythology, it's all fake, but in reality, it's not all fake. These people left behind such detailed records and information. It's a time capsule of information on stone tablets.
That approach can be useful. Symbolic interpretation reveals cultural meaning, but it can also shut down inquiry. His point: if we dismiss ancient accounts as fantasy, we might overlook technological truths simply told in unfamiliar language.
It looks like computer code.
It does.
doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Just imagine like a human being deciding that they were going to write down in these very bizarre, and they all agreed that all these things mean a certain thing. So they had to somehow or another have a Rosetta Stone or something where they're documenting it so that people can learn it and teach it.
The language popped up out of nowhere.
Sumerian cuneiform is the world's first written language, and it does appear suddenly in the archaeological record, fully developed. There's no slow evolution from proto-writing to script. That's rare, and Carson sees it as a sign of external input. The computer code comparison reflects the highly structured, abstract nature of cuneiform, more algorithmic than pictorial.
If people were supposed to be trying to worry about how they're going to get their next meal, shelter for the night, and all these kind of things, who has time to sit down and write these incredible works of art like the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example?
Yeah.
So I think they really were writing down, and also they were transcribing information that was given to them by these quote-unquote gods with a lowercase g.
Carson challenges the idea that early civilizations were purely focused on survival. Writing requires surplus, time, food, stability, and cultural motivation. The Epic of Gilgamesh is rich in theology, astronomy, and ethics. Carson argues it reflects imported knowledge, not evolved folklore.
When you see like some of the images that they created, the images that look like the double helix from DNA, and there's a bunch of the like that now we represent the caduceus, which represents pharmacies and drugs. Like that's the old version of an image of the double helix of DNA, or at least it looks super similar to that.
Oh, it definitely is, because it's referenced even in the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
The caduceus does visually resemble a DNA strand, two serpents winding around a staff. While modern biology hadn't been discovered, Carson suggests that these symbols are more than metaphor. He implies that ancient civilizations may have had intuitive or passed down knowledge of genetic structure long before Watson and Crick.
So the craziest version of this story is that they genetically engineered us out of lower primates and put us here to mine gold.
Right.
And then established different types of civilizations and taught us how to build things, taught us all these different things, and enough time has passed that we've kind of forgotten.
Sitchin's theory that the Anunnaki altered hominids to create humans for labor sounds wild, but Carson points to real genetic experiments, like Soviet attempts to create human-ape hybrids, as proof that the concept isn't science fiction. The gold obsession is a recurring human theme, and in this theory, it wasn't cultural, it was programmed.
When you start analyzing the text, you discover that there was an encampment in a place called South Africa at Adam's Calendar. Now, at Adam's Calendar, there's actually the very first gold mines discovered. They're dating them back to about 200,000 years ago. And that's incredible because there's a building there that looks like a worn-down structure.
Mainstream science confirms that gold mining in southern Africa dates back nearly 200,000 years. Archaeologists generally attribute this to early Homo sapiens. But Carson sees that site, Adam's Calendar, as a remnant of something far older, tied to the Anunnaki's presence on Earth.
The working-class Anunnaki beings who were cleaning out the Euphrates and Tigris River so they can create irrigation and create a bustling civilization, they got tired of doing the work. According to them, for about 250,000 years of labor, they decided to go to war. And then Enki says, I have an idea that will stop this war. There's an existing being on this planet. We can add our essence to it.
This sounds like labor union mythology, but Carson treats it as allegory for a pivotal moment, the genetic modification of early humans. In the Sumerian story, the gods didn't create life from scratch. They tweaked what already existed, a move from natural selection to selective engineering.
They inserted something called a worship gene, which was just discovered recently, that human beings have a gene inside of them that can be turned on and turned off. It can be turned off in a laboratory setting. It can also be turned off with a magnetic field around your head. And when it's off, you don't want to worship anything outside of yourself. You look inside, and when it's on, you look to get something from the outside.
There is a cluster of brain activity known as the God spot, linked to spiritual experiences. Some researchers have speculated about neurological predisposition for belief. Carson takes this further, suggesting it was hardwired by design, not evolution. It's a radical reinterpretation of human devotion, not as choice, but as function.
Scientists in the Soviet Union, correct? They're experimenting with creating a chimpanzee human being hybrid that they would probably send to war. And now if you're supremely enlightened being, wouldn't you think of human beings with all of our folly and all of our chaos and all of our war and bullshit? Wouldn't you think of us kind of the same way we would think about that chimp hybrid thing?
By comparing our creators to ourselves, Carson flips the hierarchy. If we're disgusted by the idea of hybrid soldiers, how would an enlightened race feel about us? For Carson, we're not the peak, we're the project. From ancient gods designing humans to obey, to modern governments doing the same with data, what if the real masters now watch us from cubicles instead of clouds? The September 11th Surveillance State Genesis. In episode number 1368, Joe Rogan talks with Edward Snowden, the man who risked everything to blow the whistle on America's mass surveillance machine. But this conversation doesn't just revisit the NSA leaks. It reveals how the 9/11 attacks triggered a self-preserving panic inside U.S. intelligence and birthed a system that turned its gaze inward.
I had a really weird history in the intelligence community. I grew up in a federal family in the shadow of Fort Meade, right? All these little suburban communities in Maryland where basically the entire industry of the state is the federal government of all these different agencies, and then all the subcontractors, all the defense industries that serve that government. My mother worked for the district courts, or rather the federal courts, and it's kind of funny because she still works there, and those are the courts that are trying to throw me in jail for the rest of my life. My father worked for the Coast Guard, retired after 30 years. My grandfather was an admiral, and then he worked for the FBI. As far back as it goes, my family, my whole line of family, even generations back, was working for the government.
Snowden was raised by the system. His life was hardwired for government service, making his eventual rebellion that much more profound. When someone that embedded walks away, it's not an accident, it's a signal flare.
And I dropped out of high school. They called it concurrent enrollment, where I'm not taking any classes at high school, I'm going to community college instead. I ran into somebody at the community college who ran their own home-based business, doing web design. And they went, hey, do you want to work for me? And I was like, well, that sounds great. She was married to an NSA analyst, a linguist, right? And she ran her business out of their home on Fort Meade. But then 9/11 happens. I was probably 18 years old. What people forget is who knew what was going on before anybody else? The intelligence community. And what did they do? At the moments we need them the most, they're the first ones in the country that are leaving their buildings.
The most informed, most connected people in the country, the ones with all the warning signs, didn't step up. They stepped out. The CIA, NSA, all ran skeleton crews at the precise moment their mission should have activated.
I think it's James Bamford who interviewed that director of NSA who gave that order about what was happening. He was going, well, you know, he called his wife and he was asking where their kids were and everything like that. And then after that, he wanted to think about, well, where could these other planes that they knew were in the air that hadn't struck yet, where could they be headed? They could hit the White House. They could hit Congress. They could hit the Supreme Court, right? And they go, oh, they're going to fly their planes into the CIA headquarters, or they're going to fly their planes into the NSA headquarters. On that basis, they were like, ooh, let's get our bacon out of the pan.
Snowden reveals the truth most people miss. The intelligence world isn't fearless. It's cautious, political, and risk-averse. When faced with the unknown, their instinct wasn't to defend the country. It was to protect their own.
If you have built history's greatest surveillance agencies, right? The most powerful intelligence forces in the history of the species, you are going to take those off the board, or at least the majority of their personnel off the board then, in a chance that you have no sort of grounds for substantiating that they could be targeting you. It's about risk management for them, right? It's about never being criticized for something.
And this mindset didn't just affect evacuation orders. It shaped everything that came after September 11th. The public was told these agencies needed more power. In reality, they had failed at using the power they already had.
People ask about, people still criticize me. In the book, I talk about aliens and chemtrails and things like that, and the fact that there's no evidence for that. I went looking on the network, right? And I know, Joe, I know you want there to be aliens.
I do.
I know Neil deGrasse Tyson badly wants there to be aliens. But the idea that we're hiding them, if we are hiding them, I had ridiculous access to the networks of the NSA, the CIA, the military, all these groups. I couldn't find anything, right? So if it's hidden, and it could be hidden, it's hidden really damn well. There are real conspiracies But they're not typically, they've got tens of thousands of people working on them, unless you're talking about the existence of the intelligence community itself, which is basically constructed on the idea that you can get, I think there's 4 million or 1.4 million people in the United States who hold security clearances. And you can get all of these people to not talk, ever, to journalists, or this, that, or the other.
The silence isn't proof of alien life. It's proof of something more mundane and more dangerous. Bureaucratic loyalty, job protection, and a fear of stepping out of line. Real conspiracies don't need little green men. They thrive in the HR departments of federal agencies.
It goes, the reason that these attacks happened, the reason that they weren't prevented, is what they call stovepiping, right? There was not enough sharing. If the FBI wanted to send absolutely everything they had to the CIA, they could have done so. If the CIA wanted to send everything they had to the FBI, they could have done so. They didn't, and people died as a result. Every office is fighting the other office for budget, for clout, for promotions. And this is the sad reality of what actually happened. And they didn't realize how serious it was until it was too late, because they were competing with each other rather than cooperating.
Instead of fixing the humans, they rewrote the rules, giving those same flawed agencies the green light to spy on everyone, everywhere.
I don't care who does it, stop it. And they said this to Dick Cheney. And what he did was he took that little dial on what we're not allowed to do, and he changed it all the way until it broke and snapped off, and then there was nothing that we couldn't do anymore.
Cheney knew the machinery better than anyone, and he used that fear to remove every obstacle between government power and public privacy.
We see it happen in Turkey with Erdogan, right? We've seen it happen successively with bad governments, even in Western democracies. We see it happening, sadly, in places like Poland and Hungary. You can even argue it's happening in the United Kingdom, right? And now there are a lot of people arguing that's exactly what we're seeing with Donald Trump's White House in the United States. When we become fearful, we become vulnerable, right, to anyone who promises they will make things better, even if they have no ability to make things better, even if they will actively make things worse. But if they tell you that they'll make things better, and you believe them in a moment of fear, that typically leads to unfortunate outcomes.
While Snowden warned us how fear can twist systems of power, this next conversation deals with something bigger than governments, something cosmic. Because if the universe itself is misunderstood, then every truth we build on top of it might already be wrong. The Scientific Evolution Defense. In episode number 1904, Joe sits down with astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson to talk about one of the most powerful instruments ever built, the James Webb Space Telescope. But instead of confirming what we already know, many online are claiming it might unravel the very fabric of cosmology. Could the Big Bang Theory itself be on the chopping block? Neil pushes back, but not in the way you'd expect.
So that's been people's first question, and what I want to do is temper that to say something a little different. So yes, we expect James Webb to make great discoveries. We expect that. But the first order of business is hardly ever, let's discover something new today. It's, here's something that we have limited understanding of, let's improve on that. And in so doing, we deepen our understanding of how things work in the universe. That doesn't always involve overturning a previous idea or discovering something that nobody ordered. That will happen. We fully expect that to happen. But we targeted parts of the sky initially because we know other telescopes have gone there before. And we're going to say, how can we further advance and deepen our understanding?
One of the biggest misunderstandings about the James Webb Telescope is that it was built to replace our models, when in fact, it's been positioned to refine them. Its infrared capabilities allow it to look back further in time, not to debunk the Big Bang, but to investigate those first 100 million years after it, a period called the Cosmic Dawn, which the Hubble simply couldn't penetrate. The goal isn't to overturn science, it's to fill in the blanks.
Okay, so the way to think about this is, and this is the way science has worked since basically the year 1600, where Galileo sort of starts codifying what people knew probably should be happening, but no one really did it in large scale. If you have an idea about something, then you test it multiple ways and get other people to test it. And if the tests give you consistent results, you have a new understanding of the universe. When that happens, that knowledge of the universe doesn't go away. It doesn't get undone. What happens typically is you have a deeper understanding of the universe in which that understanding gets embedded. And you realize that you only understood a small part of a larger whole.
This is exactly how models like heliocentrism, quantum mechanics, and relativity built on each other. Galileo didn't kill religion, he pushed it out of astronomy, and Newton's gravity wasn't invalidated by Einstein. It just turned out to be incomplete at extreme speeds or near massive objects. The same logic applies to the Big Bang. Even if we're inside a multiverse, that doesn't erase the data that got us here. It reframes it.
And so then do we throw Newton out the window? No, actually. You know what Newton's laws are? They're what Einstein's laws look like when you put in low speeds and low gravity. If you put in low speeds, they become Newton's laws. In that limit, Newton's laws don't stop working where they used to work. Apollo to the moon used only Newton's laws because Einstein didn't matter at those scales.
There's even a name for this kind of model layering, effective theory. It means a scientific theory works perfectly well in its domain until a more comprehensive framework comes along to explain the exceptions. Think of it like driving directions. Newton gets you through town. Einstein handles the cross-country trip.
So now I've got this Big Bang thing, okay? And, well, is this embedded in something bigger? Ooh. So when you put like quantum physics and general relativity and you try to come up with some bigger understanding, deeper understanding, string theorists have been all into this, you get a multiverse. We didn't pull that out of our ass, that came out of the equations. So how old is the multiverse? I don't know. It's definitely older than our universe because it birthed our universe and it births other universes.
The multiverse is a consequence of trying to reconcile the physics of the very large, Einstein's relativity, with the physics of the very small, quantum mechanics. When physicists simulate the inflationary period of the early universe, certain models suggest that the inflation doesn't just stop, it keeps going, creating other bubbles of space-time, each bubble a potential universe.
And so that is what comes out of the equations. So that makes the Big Bang a kind of a small part of a much larger whole. And so, yeah, we're ready for that. But the fact that the universe had a beginning 14 billion years ago, and there's the cosmic microwave background, all of these features are intact. They're not going to all of a sudden not apply.
The cosmic microwave background is still the most important piece of evidence for the Big Bang. It's not theoretical. It's observable, measurable radiation, left over from when the universe cooled enough to form atoms. And Webb wasn't built to contradict the CMB. It was calibrated to understand how the first galaxies formed because of it. If Neil deGrasse Tyson grounded the Big Bang in evidence, this next guess stretches space itself, literally. Because when physicist Brian Cox joined Joe, the conversation drifted into warp drives, wormholes, and time machines. But here's the twist. The math works. It's reality that doesn't cooperate. When the math says yes, but the universe says no. In episode number 1233, Joe sat down with British physicist Brian Cox to explore the wildest corners of theoretical physics, the kind of stuff that fuels both science fiction and conspiracy forums. They dive into faster-than-light travel, space folding, and whether wormholes or time machines are hiding in black-budget labs. And surprisingly, Cox doesn't dismiss the ideas, at least not on paper.
Well, did you like Event Horizon?
Yeah, I did actually. I thought that was
fun,
quite
right?
a cool film. Yeah,
ridiculous.
I haven't seen it for
fun.
years.
I always wanted to ask about their concept of propulsion. That almost like space would be flat, you would fold space over, and you would intersect those 2 points, and you would be able to travel vast distances instantaneously. Right? I'm doing a terrible job of explaining it, I'm sure, but is that a concept that people have actually considered?
Yeah, you can in general relativity. So Einstein's, I should say what it is. Einstein's theory of general relativity is our best theory of space and time, and so it really is, as we talked about before. It's, you imagine space and time as a sheet. Just imagine it as a thing, sort of literally a sheet, a surface. And all the theory says is that if you put matter and or energy into that then it curves it and distorts it, and it can stretch it and make it shrink. The simplest version would be the sun. So you put a big spherical ball of stuff in there, and it warps space and time such that the nice straight lines, something just travelling, minding its own business through that warp space, turns into an orbit.
This is where physics allows for the bizarre. Folding space isn't fantasy. It's a real solution in Einstein's field equations called an Alcubierre drive, first published in 1994. The math shows you can compress space in front of a spacecraft and expand it behind, essentially surfing a wave of spacetime. But like Cox says, there's a catch. It demands exotic matter with negative energy density, something never seen in any lab.
Question becomes, what sort of stuff would you have to actually put into the real universe to make it warp in that way? And it usually turns out that it's the kind of stuff that doesn't exist, right? But it has properties. It's sort of matter or sort of energy that has properties that do not exist in nature as far as we can tell. But you can still write the geometry down. So you can do it, and you can do the calculations, and you can see the warp drive. You can construct wormholes that connect distant regions of the universe, which you could use as time machines. You can do all that in the theory, but in nature, you'd have to have the right stuff to do it.
But that stuff is not real.
That seems to be
as far as we know.
Yeah.
This is the key distinction. Physics doesn't just describe what is. It can describe what could be, too. But that doesn't mean the universe obliges. Physicists can manipulate equations to model time loops, shortcuts across galaxies, and ships passing through wormholes. These are legitimate exercises in mathematical physics, but until we find matter with imaginary mass or negative pressure, they stay on the chalkboard.
So wormholes is a good example. So that would be, quite literally, we talked about the surface of the Earth. So you fly to Australia from LA and you have to go quite a long way around the edge of the Earth. Or you could tunnel straight through and get there quicker, right? So that's a wormhole.
Jamie's got a little graphic up there.
There it is. There's a wormhole. So you could go all the way around the edge, or you could take the shortcut. So the question is, so you can do that in Einstein's theory. You can write down that geometry.
Right.
There's a second set of bits of theoretical work, which are, if you had a wormhole, then what would happen if you tried to travel through it? And what seems to happen is that they become unstable the moment that anything tries to go through. So you get kind of a feedback of stuff going through and through and through and through, and so it collapses. The answer is we don't fully know, but most physicists think that even if they existed, they would be unstable.
Wormholes are theoretically traversable, but likely not practically. Kip Thorne, who Cox mentions, did serious work on this in the 1980s, laying the foundation for Interstellar's physics. But even he admitted wormholes would collapse under real-world conditions, especially if any matter, like light or people, tried to pass through. That feedback collapse? It's not just science fiction. It's what general relativity predicts.
And ultimately, the reason we don't really know absolutely is because you need what's called a quantum theory of gravity, and we don't have one. So we don't have the theoretical tools to be absolutely sure that these things would be unstable or don't exist in nature. But we strongly suspect that they don't. If they did, you could build a time machine. So Stephen Hawking wrote a paper called the Chronology Protection Conjecture. And conjecture is the important word. So the conjecture basically was that the laws of nature will be such that you can't have stable wormholes and you can't build time machines.
And if you sent something through it, it would destabilize it.
Yeah.
And if it didn't destabilize it, how would your physical body deal with the stress of that?
Well, it doesn't have to be. That you can build them. That's called the tidal gravitational force. So it's the difference in gravitational pull across your body, which is one of the things that gets you if you fall into a black hole. So before you actually get to the singularity, you can get, it's called spaghettified.
The spaghettification Cox mentions isn't a metaphor. It's a measurable phenomenon. As you approach a black hole, gravity at your feet becomes significantly stronger than at your head. This vertical gravitational gradient stretches the body like taffy. In theory, wormholes could be engineered to avoid this, but only under very specific, highly contrived conditions. And again, you'd still need matter that breaks known physical laws.
You can write the geometry down in Einstein's theory such that you could go through. So you don't have to be destroyed or anything weird happen to you.
Would you have to have something protecting you, some force, some sort of a?
Yeah, you just literally you fall through. I mean, so if they would exist, you just go through. You sit in a little spaceship.
And that's the part the conspiracy crowd ignores. Yes, the theories are real, but they depend on materials and energies that might be impossible, not just improbable. No known particle or field exhibits the negative pressure needed to hold a wormhole open. If governments have this tech, they'd also need physics we don't yet understand. And if aliens use it, then they've solved problems our best physicists are still struggling to define. Brian Cox showed us what happens when physics opens the door to impossibility. But what if the real mystery isn't in the stars? It's buried right here on Earth? When Robert Schoch looked at the Great Sphinx, he didn't see wind erosion, he saw rainfall, and everything we thought we knew about history started to crumble. The water erosion revolution. In episode number 1124, Joe sits down with geologist and professor Robert Schoch, the man whose work helped kickstart one of the biggest ancient history debates of our time. Schoch challenges the mainstream dating of the Sphinx, arguing it was weathered by rain, meaning it was carved thousands of years before dynastic Egypt even existed. The implications? There was an advanced civilization on Earth before the end of the last ice age, and it may have been wiped out by the sun itself.
Well, his work, that DVD series that he did, Magical Egypt, was amazing.
Yeah.
And I had seen your work before that in that Mysteries of the Sphinx thing that was narrated by Charlton Heston.
NBC, 1993. Yeah. I think in many ways it was the Mystery of the Sphinx that really broke everything open. It brought everything to the public attention. I've had many people tell me, I'm not trying to brag or anything, I'm just saying factually, that this really opened up a new field, if we could put it that way, a new way of looking at things. And you have to remember, I'm a faculty member. I'm at Boston University. I'm an academic. And many of the academics have poo-pooed, should we say, over the years, bringing things to the public. But I think it's been important.
That 1993 documentary was a turning point. It aired on NBC primetime, something virtually unheard of for anything challenging academic orthodoxy. The footage juxtaposed geological anomalies with mainstream claims, forcing the question, why does the Sphinx enclosure show signs of rainfall erosion if it's been sitting in the Sahara for 5,000 years? Schoch's assertion wasn't just that archaeologists missed something, it was that they ignored geology altogether.
Now, what we're talking about for the people that are uninformed is the idea that some of the structures in ancient Egypt are far older than conventional wisdom or conventional modern-day archaeology, modern-day Egyptologists. They would like us to believe that all of this spawned from a very specific time period, and people like John Anthony West and yourself and some other folks like Graham Hancock are proposing that it's entirely possible that there were many different eras of construction in Egypt and that there are some structures that are far, far older than we think.
John Anthony West, he became interested in the work of the late Schwaller de Lubitsch, who passed away in 1961, but he had mentioned in one line that the Sphinx had been weathered by rain. I would say precipitation as a geologist, not wind and sand. So this, if it were true, and it is true, would put the Sphinx back to a much earlier period.
The rain weathering theory hinges on a key distinction: vertical erosion patterns. In geology, wind erosion leaves horizontal scouring marks, while precipitation carves downward fissures. Schoch saw those vertical cuts in the Sphinx enclosure and knew instantly it didn't match the dry climate of the last 5,000 years. That means either our climate models are wrong, or the Sphinx is much older than the dynastic Egyptians who supposedly built it.
I had gone to Yale University to get my PhD in geology and geophysics, so I thought when I first went to Egypt, I would just prove West wrong. I would just prove that the Egyptologists knew what they were talking about. But, and this is an important but, I was also trained in many ways, both as a graduate student and going back to my grandmother, who I had great respect for, and was also very, should we say, liberal and open-minded, but critical. You always have to follow the evidence wherever it goes, and that's always been my rule of thumb. And all of that changed literally within 30, without exaggerating, 30
to 120 seconds of first seeing
Really?
the Sphinx. Yeah, it really did.
What was your
really
first
did.
impression?
Because my first impression of the Sphinx was, now that I saw it on the ground in person, this was not weathered by wind and sand. This was not desert erosion and weathering that I saw. When they carved the Sphinx, it's all solid bedrock. Only the head initially was above the ground surface. They carved down into the rock to free up the body, what I call the core body of the Sphinx. And it's that core body and the walls of the enclosure, more or less the quarry around it, if you want to use that term, that show these ancient weathering, precipitation, erosional features that are incompatible with the last 5,000 years of climatic history.
Even early Egyptologists in the 19th century speculated the Sphinx looked older than the pyramids, based purely on intuition. But Schoch didn't stop at a hunch. He brought in seismic surveys, analyzed weathering patterns, and compared them to known climate data. His conclusion? The damage was consistent with sustained rainfall that ended over 10,000 years ago. This lines up with the Younger Dryas, a sudden global climate shift that closed out the last ice age.
Now I believe we're talking prior to 9700 BC for the original construction of the Sphinx, and we can talk about why the dating. And at 9700 BC, we have the end of the Younger Dryas, the end of the glacial epoch, the end of the last ice age. What we had ending the Younger Dryas, ending the last ice age, was a huge eruption from the sun, a huge solar outburst, huge climatic changes, which put, among other things, a lot of precipitation, a lot of moisture into the air, which came down as precipitation with huge floods, huge essentially thunderstorms, etc. And I think a lot of the initial erosion that we still see on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure go back to that period.
Before that, it was some sort of a rainforest.
It's savanna to rainforest. It actually varied over time, and before that it was very fertile savanna, lots of plants there. People have seen it even in popular movies and whatnot, how the Sahara at one point had water and all kinds of animals.
This is where Schoch goes beyond geology and into catastrophe theory. He believes the same solar outburst that ended the Ice Age also triggered civilization collapse. Not only would it explain the Sphinx's weathering, it could explain vitrified rock, melt layers, and cultural memory of global floods. This reframes the origin of ancient Egypt, not as a beginning, but as a restart after a 6,000-year dark age.
The Egyptians called Zep-Tepi. This was a first time for them, or what I call an earlier cycle of civilization. Between that period, so thousands of years, 9700 BC to say 3700 BC for round numbers, 6,000 years, we have essentially a dark period, and what I've been now calling Siddha, solar-induced dark age.
Zep-Tepi appears in Egyptian texts as a mythological golden age, a time when the gods walk the earth. Mainstream scholars dismiss it as metaphor, but Schoch argues it may be cultural memory of a lost civilization. His solar-induced dark age theory suggests that high civilization existed well before history books begin, and it was the sun, not war or famine, that hit the reset button. But if ancient Egypt hides clues in stone, the Amazon hides them beneath the trees, and what we're finding there might be even bigger: the lost Amazon civilization. In episode number 1284, Joe talks with Graham Hancock, whose investigations into the Amazon are overturning long-held beliefs about what ancient people were capable of. Most of us picture the rainforest as untouched wilderness, but Hancock says it's more like a lost empire, one that once held cities the size of London, invented artificial soil that still defies explanation, and built massive geometrical structures aligned to the stars.
The Amazon is a colossal mystery, and it's one of the subjects that I explore in depth in America before. First of all, to give some basic figures, the Amazon basin is huge. The Amazon basin is 7 million square kilometers in area. And within it, 5.5 million square kilometers remains almost entirely unstudied by archaeologists. And that's the 5.5 million square kilometers that is still covered by dense rainforest. And to put that into perspective, 5.5 million square kilometers is the size of the entire Indian subcontinent. So it's like saying, we've done world archaeology, but we've just ignored India.
This isn't exaggeration. In terms of scale, we've barely scratched the surface of South America's interior. Until recently, archaeologists assumed the rainforest was too poor to support large populations. But deforestation has accidentally exposed the truth. Vast cities, buried under centuries of growth, now peeking out from satellite data and bulldozed jungle.
The view was, again, there was a dogma, there was a preconception. Human beings couldn't have flourished in the Amazon. It's not a resource-rich area. The soils are poor. It's a difficult area, challenging to get to, very far from the Bering Straits. So the view was that humans hadn't entered the Amazon until about 1,000 years ago. And then gradually, little by little, that view has begun to change. And it's begun to change because of the tragic clearances of the Amazon, because the Amazon rainforest is literally being cut down and turned into soybean farms and cattle ranches. There was a Spanish explorer who went down the Amazon River system in 1541 to 1542. He was the first European to cross the entire length of South America from west to east along the Amazon. He reported seeing incredible cities, advanced arts and crafts, millions of people, a thriving culture. And 100 years later, when other Europeans got into the Amazon, they couldn't find these cities. So they said, oh, Francisco Orellana, that was his name, made it all up.
Orellana's report was dismissed for centuries, but it turns out his timing was tragic. The Spanish brought smallpox into the Amazon basin, and within decades, entire populations were wiped out. The jungle overtook their abandoned cities, erasing a civilization from memory until now.
Now the jungle's being cleared, those cities are emerging, and we can say that a city like London, which had a population of roughly 50,000 in the 16th century, there were cities of that size all over the Amazon. Wow. Huge numbers of them. And a possible total population of the Amazon that exceeded 20 million people.
That would make pre-Columbian Amazonia one of the most densely populated regions on Earth at the time. But to sustain that many people, you need something the rainforest lacks: fertile soil. That's where things get even weirder.
Rainforest soils are poor. It's one of the reasons these soybean farms are a really stupid idea, because once you clear the rainforest, the land is largely unfertile and you can't grow stuff on it for very long. So how did they feed all these people? The answer was they invented a soil. And that soil has a name. It's called terra preta. Archaeologists refer to it as Amazonian dark earths or Amazonian black earth. It's a man-made soil. It's thousands of years old. It's full of microbes that are not found in adjoining soil. It's based around biochar. And you can take a handful of 8,000-year-old terra preta and you can add it to barren soil, and that soil will instantly become fertile.
Terra preta is ancient and alive. The microbial content still baffles modern scientists. It contains biochar, a carbon-rich product created through controlled burns, but the full process hasn't been replicated. This was agricultural engineering that's never been matched.
One way that it was achieved was to do wet burning of middens. They would be burned and smolder. They wouldn't burn fiercely, which just produces charcoal. They would burn and smolder, and that what is called biochar would result, and that's part of the fertility of the soil. But the mystery is the microbial content of this soil, which is completely different from the microbes in neighboring soils, and that remains unexplained.
And if agriculture was advanced, so was the rest of their world. The rainforest was cultivated. Certain trees, like Brazil nuts and ice cream beans, dominate the canopy because ancient humans selected and planted them, creating a giant man-made garden over millennia.
The Amazon is basically a garden. The Amazon is a man-made rainforest. There are certain trees like Brazil nut trees or the ice cream bean tree, which are food crops, which are very, very valuable, and they dominate the tree regime in the Amazon. They're what's referred to as hyperdominant species. In other words, people living in the Amazon over thousands of years selected certain trees, which they then cultivated and grew.
But it goes even further. Deep in this cultivated jungle, LiDAR scans are uncovering massive earthworks, moats, embankments, and geometrical figures with mathematical precision.
What we find in the Amazon are thousands of henges that are now beginning to emerge from the cleared area of the jungle, and others that have been identified for the first time with LiDAR. And I'm intrigued by these huge geometrical figures, which involve primarily circles and squares. And they are classic henges in the sense that they are deep ditches surrounded by huge embankments. They're extremely geometrical. For example, you can find an octagon surrounding a square. At a place called Jacosá in the Amazon, you can find a square perfectly enclosing a circle. Now that is an exercise called squaring the circle that our academics have given to the Greeks. They said the Greeks were the first people who performed that exercise. But now we find in dated sites in the Amazon that this was being done in the Amazon long before the Greeks.
Some of these structures are perfectly aligned to true astronomical north, not magnetic north. That requires observational astronomy. That means they were tracking celestial movement, understanding geometry, and executing designs on a scale that required mass labor and centralized planning.
What's fascinating about them is this very powerful geometry and astronomy. So a number of the sites are perfectly aligned to true north, true south, true east, and true west. I'm not talking about magnetic north, I'm talking about true astronomical north. To do that, there's only one way to do it, and that's with astronomy. So that tells us that astronomers were at work in the Amazon. The geometry is very complex and very precise. That tells us that people with geometrical skills were at work in the Amazon. And thirdly, the scale of the sites of hundreds of meters, gigantic earthworks on the scale of hundreds of meters, tells us that this was highly organized project.
These weren't villages or marketplaces, no refuse, no dwellings, no tools of daily life. Hancock argues they were ceremonial, possibly spiritual, aligned to stars, laid out in patterns reflecting sacred geometry, and tied to beliefs about the soul and afterlife.
None of these sites were lived in. There's no habitation refuse found in them whatsoever. We don't know what they were used for. I make the case in America before that they're connected to a system of ideas which is found all around the world, which is to do with death and the afterlife destiny of the soul.
If Hancock's lost Amazon cities show how quickly ancient knowledge can vanish, this next theory reveals something else. The myth of human exceptionalism. What if we've been looking at ourselves all wrong? The variation reality. In episode number 1561, Joe speaks with science journalist Kermit Pattison about human evolution and how everything we think we know about it might be a little too self-congratulatory. Humans didn't arrive at perfection. We're just a bizarre branch on a very messy evolutionary tree. And if you think your feet were meant for Nike Airs, think again.
The reason why I ask, have you ever seen images of indigenous people in the Amazon that walk around barefoot and their feet literally start to look like hands? They splay out in a very bizarre way.
I haven't seen those particular pictures, but I do know that people that walk around unshod, so in other words, without shoes, tend to develop these toes that are more divergent, not opposable like a primate, but for whatever reason about being unshod, it just gives you, you look at the toe and it's like visibly separated.
Yes, we're looking at a picture of it right now on the screen. We're showing and it's very strange, where it's almost like they're gripping the ground with their toes.
The phenomenon Rogan is describing isn't rare at all. Studies on groups like the Dasanic in Ethiopia show that lifelong barefoot walking leads to wider feet, better balance, and even changes in bone density. In contrast, modern footwear, especially narrow, rigid shoes, has led to widespread issues like bunions and collapsed arches. Essentially, we've outsourced foot evolution to Nike, and the result isn't always functional.
So you realize there's nothing about our form that's like an end destination. There's nothing about our form that is like, we have arrived at this was, where primates were going the whole time. It's if you want to talk about who are the weird ones, it's not all these other things. It's like the modern humans are weird. We got these big heads. We got this funny way of walking. We're bald,
and we vary so much.
Modern humans are anatomically bizarre. Our heads are so large relative to our birth canals that human babies are born earlier in development compared to other primates, just to make it through labor. And our upright gait, it's an energy-efficient adaptation for walking long distances, but it's also why we suffer from back pain, hernias, and weak knees. We're optimized for survival, not comfort.
You know, there's all these kind of myths about why, I mean, God, there's so many myths in the field of human origins, but one of them is, you've probably heard about like the divine proportions, or like golden ratio, that humans were constructed, you know, according to these ratios and of the so-called golden ratio. I mean, this is just storytelling. You know, I mean, there's nothing about our proportions. Our proportions are just a function of adaptation.
That golden ratio, roughly 1 to 1.618, shows up everywhere from pyramids to Renaissance art. But using it to claim humans are designed to divine standards is pseudoscience. Studies show human limb proportions vary wildly depending on climate, with tropical populations tending toward longer limbs, Allen's rule, and cold-adapted populations having shorter extremities to conserve heat. Evolution didn't build us to be beautiful. It built us to function in specific environments.
Modern humans, though, we do vary size-wise much more than ancient apes that we find, though, correct? Like, we don't find, like, for instance, like, you know Mountain from the Game of Thrones, that enormous giant human being? That's a human being. He's literally one of the world's strongest men. He's like 7 feet plus tall, 300 plus pounds, enormous. But my point was that, like, that he exists as a human being. Also, Chris Rock is a human being, and he's a very thin, very small man. Like, but they're both human beings.
Actually, in some cases, there's a lot of variation. And I'll give you one good example. So, Lucy, you know, there's this famous fossil. Lucy the species is called Australopithecus afarensis, named afarensis after the Afar, you know, this part of the world that I was describing, the Afar Depression. She was discovered in 1974. She's very petite, probably a female. A few years ago, a team announced discovery of another skeleton of Lucy's species. It's a male. It's a lot bigger than Lucy. They call it Katanumu, which is a Afar word for big guy.
Katanumu's discovery in 2010 was a game changer. It proved that Australopithecus afarensis wasn't a uniform population of tiny proto-humans. This isn't surprising. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and humans all show sexual dimorphism, where males and females have different average sizes. The variation between Lucy and Katanumu is just another example that evolution favors flexibility, not consistency.
And why is that? Is that because there's a so-called sexual dimorphism of males are bigger than females, or is it just a different population, or is that just a difference in, you know, the normal range within a population? You know, like you have short people and tall people, you know, in our, you know, in any population. I don't know what the answer is to that.
But they're both mature specimens.
But yeah, and they're both attributed to the same species.
Here's what makes this important. Paleoanthropology used to build entire species definitions on 1 or 2 fossils. But as more specimens are found, it becomes clear that ancient species weren't carbon copies. Like humans today, they came in different shapes and sizes. Lucy and Katanumu might have lived in the same era, but they represent a full spectrum within their species, just like us. But this next one, nobody expected to hear about on the podcast, the lost city that shouldn't exist. In episode number 1742, Joe Rogan sits down with Jimmy Corsetti, the man behind Bright Insight, to dive deep into a theory that challenges everything we thought we knew about Atlantis. The conversation centers around the Richat structure in Mauritania, a remote circular formation in the Sahara Desert that might be more than a geological oddity. According to Corsetti, it could be the remains of a global empire wiped out by a cataclysm, just as Plato described. The implications go far beyond folklore because this theory connects Atlantis to one of the most significant climate disasters in history, the Younger Dryas impact event.
So the Atlantis one.
So, the Richat structure. I was wondering if you saw those videos, Joe.
Yeah, no, that was a big one that I saw because I've been fascinated by the concept of Atlantis. You know, ever since I had these conversations with Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock about the Younger Dryas impact theory and this concept that somewhere in the roughly around 11,000, 12,000 years ago, we were hit by a series of comets. And it's pretty evident that that's a fact. If you do the core samples of the Earth, they find this nuclear glass all over the Earth that exists in that time period.
The term nuclear glass might sound sensational, but it's real. Trinitite, a glassy substance formed by extreme heat, has been found in locations corresponding with the proposed Younger Dryas impact. Its presence suggests an event with the kind of explosive energy we normally associate with atomic bombs or massive asteroid strikes. For proponents of the Atlantis theory, this substance is geological proof of a global reset, one that erased evidence of advanced pre-Ice Age civilizations.
And it seems like something happened that reset civilization. And there's very little evidence of advanced civilizations before that up until recently, up until the last couple of decades. They started uncovering things like Göbekli Tepe and all these other structures that are clearly from more than 12,000 years ago. And they're really complex and really large with enormous stones. And it's sort of caused people to rethink the history of the Earth.
Göbekli Tepe rewrote the archaeological timeline when it was dated to 11,000 years ago, older than Stonehenge and the pyramids. It proved that megalithic construction and symbolic architecture existed long before mainstream historians expected. This opens the door to the idea that other ancient structures, like the Risha, might also predate established civilizations and could be the remains of something once thought mythical.
Atlantis was said to be a kingdom made up of, or an empire, made up of 10 kingdoms. And then there was the lost city of Atlantis, which was the capital, which was said to be made up of concentric circles, 2 of water, 3 of land, and essentially that they were obliterated by a cataclysm as passed down by Plato.
The legend of Atlantis comes from Plato's dialogues, but its origin goes deeper. According to the philosopher, the tale was passed down by Solon, who learned it during his travels in Egypt. Corsetti highlights this lineage to reinforce the credibility of the story. It didn't come from thin air, but from a civilization already considered one of the most accomplished in human history.
Plato got the story of Atlantis from Solon, who was his uncle separated by 6 generations. But what most people don't realize is that Solon had traveled to Egypt, and so it's the ancient Egyptians is where that tale comes from.
The Egyptians' own accounts, often inscribed in stone and preserved for millennia, reference earlier civilizations, eras they called Zep-Tepi, or the first time. These echoes of a pre-dynastic golden age support Corsetti's claim that Atlantis could have been a real place, destroyed and buried long before our textbooks begin.
When I first saw this, I was like, what the f*** is that? By the way, you see that white, all those white blemishes? That's salt. This was under the ocean.
The Rishat structure's most bizarre feature is its geometry, concentric circles that match Plato's layout. It's about 30 miles across, clearly visible from space, and surrounded by salt deposits in the lowest elevation zones, implying ocean submersion. Critics argue it's a collapsed volcanic dome, but Corsetti pushes back, asking why such precise dates, 100 million years, are tossed around without accounting for how drastically Earth changed in just 12,000 years.
It is currently 1,300 feet above sea level. It's 250 miles inland. And so some people say this was never under the ocean, at least not for the last tens of millions of years, is what the scientists claim. I argue that since the salt is still there,
satellite imagery confirms the structure's prominence, and Corsetti even cites Gemini astronauts using it as a landmark. More strikingly, his friend literally tasted the salt crust on site, underscoring how recently water may have filled those rings.
Even Randall Carlson himself, which let me just say, he, for a few reasons, he favors the Azores. He doesn't think this is likely to be the location for a few reasons.
He favors what?
The Azores, the island chain, which would be, it's.
And he thinks that was Atlantis?
To him, he's partial towards that. But so he analyzed this site, and you see all those striations, how it looks like the ocean, so that's all water erosion, Joe.
These patterns resemble the scoured landscapes left behind by the Missoula floods in North America, which Carlson famously used to explain catastrophic geological change. If similar patterns are etched into the Rishat's surface, the implication is massive, sudden water movement, just like what you'd expect from a younger Dryas level event.
People don't know, Joe, that the Sahara Desert wasn't a thing until approximately 5,000 years ago. It's only in the last several years, and by the way, I'm quoting MIT research here, that the Sahara goes back and forth from green to desert approximately every 20,000 years.
The Sahara's fluctuating climate adds weight to Corsetti's theory. During the last Green Sahara period, the region hosted the largest freshwater lakes in history and powerful rivers. enough to support a sprawling maritime city-state like Atlantis.
So the whole thing is 30 miles, which would be like the size of a city.
Right. Well, keep in mind the outer ring would have been water, so that wouldn't have necessarily counted. But some people will say that this is too big according to Plato's description. And let me just say that I'm like, well, hold on a second. I don't think that we should consider that, because of loss of translation, that we should consider the measurements a key detail. The question becomes, is it big enough to be a city with possibly millions of people? Because the way it was described is that it was a city that was said to be busy all day, all night, rich in trade, with languages spoken from all over.
That scale aligns with Plato's description of a bustling port hub with multiple languages, non-stop activity, and trade routes in every direction. And if that civilization was destroyed, it's no wonder no artifacts remain. The entire site could have been washed away, then buried under desert winds for thousands of years.
Plato said that it happened 9,000 years earlier, so that would be 11,600 years ago, which coincides with the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe.
For Corsetti, the correlation between Plato's date and the known end of the Younger Dryas isn't just a coincidence. It's a historical fingerprint, a massive global event, geological evidence of impact glass, salt deposits in the desert, and a site with the exact geometry described in ancient texts. It's enough to make even skeptics pause. But that's nothing compared to how crazy things got in the next episode, the simulation versus transcendence dilemma. In episode number 1133, Joe Rogan and Dennis McKenna dive into the increasingly popular theory that we may be living in a simulation. They explore how rapidly advancing technology, artificial intelligence, and the human drive to transcend biology could be evidence that the shift has already happened. They also explore whether psychedelics are a way out, or a natural safeguard built into the code.
This is the sign of the simulation. Have you considered the simulation theory?
Yes.
Might be real. Might be real. It might be real. I mean,
well, sometimes I do wonder. I mean, it's like reality, whatever we choose to call it, is becoming so weird that I often ask myself, who is writing it? And can't they get a better writer? You know, I mean, the plot is so absurd, and yet,
I began actively considering it when Congressman Weiner kept pulling his out. I was like, this is just crazy.
Right.
That guy, I'm like, this is just too much. And then when Trump won, I just was sitting down going...
Dennis isn't joking. Simulation theory is a response to how wildly unpredictable our reality has become. Between political circus acts and cultural glitches, they suggest that what we're living through feels more scripted than spontaneous. The Melania jacket moment, the rise of improbable leaders, the breakdown of cause and effect logic, it all starts looking like code gone wrong. Or worse, code doing exactly what it's meant to.
Imagine if one day someone shuts it off and the lights dim and then they turn back on and you realize, well, the game's over. How did you like it? And you're like, what? That was fake? Yeah, you just went, it only took an hour. How long did it seem? Like 50 years, you know? And you're in a simulation with artificial memories implanted into your mind. So the real question is, when we do reach that, how will we know?
Well, and what if we're already there?
Yes.
But if it is a simulation, how would we know?
Rogan doesn't just ask, what if we're living in a simulation? He asks, what happens if we build one just as convincing? Technologists like Nick Bostrom have made similar points. If we can create hyper-realistic virtual worlds, statistically, it becomes more likely that we're already inside one. This isn't hypothetical. It's a prediction based on exponential computing. But Rogan adds a twist. Would knowing change anything? Or is the point of the game that we're not supposed to know?
My real concern is that we are the last wave of the biological human. I really do believe this. If human beings continue to make more and more complex electronics with higher and higher capabilities, it's inevitable that we become symbiotic with these things, that we ingrain them into our... They're going to become a part of your body. We're going to replace body parts with more efficient body parts.
Right.
And we're one day going to create some sort of artificial life. Now, whether we become a part of that artificial life, we merge with it, or it just assumes the role of the leader of the earth, one of those things is likely to happen within the next 500 years. It's just... And that's a really generous time frame.
This is where simulation theory meets evolution. Rogan compares us to a caterpillar unknowingly spinning a digital chrysalis, one that may never contain us. His fear isn't extinction, it's obsolescence. Biological humanity becomes the scaffolding for a post-human intelligence we can't stop building. Think AI, neural implants, synthetic organs. It's not science fiction anymore, and it raises a chilling question. What if we were built the same way?
One of the things that psychedelics put in front of us, front and center, is the fact that we are getting estranged from nature.
Yeah.
You know, that's the main lesson. We're getting estranged from nature. We have to re-understand our relationship and you know, become a partner that's in the symbiosis with nature. We're extremely clever, but we're not wise.
Ooh.
That's what it is. We're not wise about what we do.
Where Rogan sees inevitability, McKenna sees a fork in the road. His argument is that psychedelics aren't just drugs, they're tools. He sees them as nature's failsafe, something embedded in our biology that forces us to reflect, slow down, and reconnect. If we're heading for a merger with machines, psychedelics might be the only thing left capable of reminding us why we were ever human to begin with. While McKenna warned us about disconnecting from nature, Musk argues that disconnection might be the only thing we've ever known. The statistical simulation argument. In episode number 1169, Elon Musk lays out what might be the most unnerving version of simulation theory yet. Instead of asking if we're in a simulation, he challenges us to explain why we wouldn't be. When every trajectory of technological progress ends in the same place, artificial realities indistinguishable from our own. The conversation dives into the impact of social media, future VR tech, and the philosophical difference between base reality and well-coded fiction.
Ultimately, is it making people happier right now? Most technology, I would say no. In fact, you and I were talking about social media before this, about just not having Instagram on your phone and not dealing, and you feel better.
Yes, I think that one of the issues with social media that's been pointed out by many people is that I think maybe particularly Instagram, people look like they have a much better life than they really do.
Right.
So
by design.
Yeah, people are posting pictures of when they're really happy. They're modifying those pictures to be better looking. Even if they're not modifying the pictures, they're at least selecting the pictures for the best lighting, the best angle. So people basically seem, they're way better looking than they basically really are.
Right.
And they're way happier seeming than they really are.
This isn't just a critique of social media. This is the opening act in Musk's simulation pitch. Instagram isn't random noise. It's humanity's first sandbox for constructing artificial lives. A curated feed is a self-authored fiction, where reality is tweaked by filters, lighting, and algorithmic dopamine. When millions prefer that digital mirror to messy truth, what happens when the fiction becomes fully immersive? Musk argues we're already halfway into the illusion, and begging for the other half.
My concern is not so much what Instagram is, but I worry about where it goes. Like, what's the next one? What's the next one? Like, where is it? Is it going to be augmented? Is some sort of a weird augmented or virtual sort of Instagram type situation where you're not going to want to live in this real world? You're going to want to interface with this sort of world that you've created through your social media page. It's some next level thing.
Go live in the simulation.
Yeah,
in the simulation.
Some Ready Player One type that's real. That seems, we have that HTC Vive here, and I've only done it a couple times, quite honestly, because it kind of freaks me out.
Sure.
My kids fucking love it, man. They love it. They love playing these weirdo games and walking around with that headset on. But part of me watching them do it goes, wow, I wonder if this is like the precursor. Just sort of like if you look at that phone that Gordon Gekko had on the beach.
Yes,
and then you compare
a big
that.
cell phone.
Yeah, you compare that to like a Galaxy Note 9.
Musk isn't imagining fantasy. He's projecting trend lines. If a clunky cell phone could evolve into a supercomputer in 2 decades, what's today's VR headset going to become by 2040? He's pointing at an exponential slope, where even casual gaming headsets become indistinguishable from physical experience. And once that happens, the leap from immersive entertainment to simulated existence isn't philosophical anymore. It's practical. It's expected.
This could be some simulation.
It could. Do you entertain that?
Well, the argument for the simulation, I think, is quite strong, because if you assume any improvement at all over time, any improvement, 1%, 0.1%, just extend the time frame, make it 1,000 years, a million years. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. What would civilization, if you counted, if you're very generous, civilization is maybe 7,000 or 8,000 years old, if you count it from the first writing. This is nothing. This is nothing. So if you assume any rate of improvement at all, then games will be indistinguishable from reality, or civilization will end. One of those two things will occur. Therefore, we are most likely in a simulation.
Here's the crux of Musk's logic bomb. If simulations become possible, they become inevitable. And once they're inevitable, it becomes statistically absurd to assume that we're in the first original layer of reality. Think about it. If a future species runs billions of ancestor simulations, then the base reality is just one version among billions. Why would this one be real? It probably isn't.
We could most certainly be on the road. We could be on the road to that, right? It doesn't mean that it has to have already happened.
We could be in base reality. We could be in base reality.
We could be here now on our way to the road or on our way to the destination where this can never happen again, where we are completely ingrained in some sort of an artificial technology or some sort of a symbiotic relationship with the internet or the next level of sharing information. We're not quite there yet. That this is real. When I touch that
it feels
wood,
very real.
Maybe that's why everybody's like into like mason jars and suede shoes. People are into like craft restaurants and they want raw wood. Everyone wants to see metal. It seems like people are like longing towards some weird log cabin type nostalgia.
Sure, reality.
Yeah, like holding on, like clinging.
This is the emotional counterweight to Musk's logic, the psychological resistance to knowing we're fake. People grasp for wood, fire, fabric, anything textured and imperfect, as if it will prove something real still exists. But Musk argues that even that clinging is part of the simulation. It's how we're programmed to respond when reality starts glitching at the seams. If Elon Musk made you question whether reality was even real, this next theory will make you wonder if the moon is part of the code. What's on the dark side of the moon? In episode number 2331, Joe and AJ dig into some of the strangest lunar claims out there, that the moon's geometry might not be natural, that remote viewers like Ingo Swann saw alien activity on the far side, and that whistleblowers, some of whom died under strange circumstances, have tried to leak photos of structures NASA never released. But every time we get close to answers, the signal is buried under a layer of misdirection, misinformation, and suspicious silence.
And then there's the moon.
And then the moon's weird too.
The moon's really weird.
The moon's super weird.
The size of the moon directly corresponding, like when it's in orbit with the sun, completely blocks out the sun perfectly.
It's 1/400th the size of the sun, and it's 400 times closer to the Earth than the sun. You never see the dark side, which is very weird. It's actually, I believe it's closer to the Earth than what you would normally expect for a moon.
And it's huge.
It's huge. You have cultures actually talking about a pre-moon period, and it's stabilizing the climate. You have the Zulu cultures talking about this.
That 1/400th ratio is freakishly precise. Scientists explain it as coincidence, but the odds are astronomical. Total solar eclipses are only possible because of this perfect ratio, a ratio that no other known planetary satellite shares. Ancient cultures claiming a time before the moon, that's less myth and more like collective memory we don't understand yet.
This is the weirdest stuff about the moon. Apollo 11, I believe, when the booster took off on the moon, they were like, oh, we think it might be hollow, and it's, it seems like actually the outer layer of the moon is less dense, is more dense than lower layers, which pattern matches only to an excavation site. That's obviously, in Earth, the lower you go, it's more dense, right? And so Apollo 12, they intentionally crashed the booster of the lunar vehicle onto the moon. They put seismometers there, and they said that it rang like a bell. This is all fact. You could look all of this stuff.
Ringing like a bell is a seismic anomaly. NASA recorded lunar reverberations that lasted up to an hour, something you don't see on Earth because of our planet's molten core. Some physicists propose the moon has a titanium-rich shell, but the excavation pattern has fueled the artificial satellite theory for decades. Hollow doesn't mean empty. It could mean built.
Lowest probability, craziest thing is Ingo Swann, who is another remote viewer in the Stargate program. He wrote a book called Penetration, where he's basically like abducted by this guy in a suit, like this kind of Men in Black style guy named Axelrod, and he is told to remote view the moon, and he remote views an alien base on the moon. And he says that he gets it. The whole thing goes crazy. I mean, the book is insane. It's like he then ends up in a supermarket and he says that he senses that this woman at the produce aisle is like an alien or something. But a lot of people from that Stargate program remote viewed, structures on the dark side of the moon.
It sounds insane until you remember the CIA actually funded the Stargate program for over 20 years. Ingo Swann accurately remote viewed coordinates he wasn't supposed to know. Whether you believe his alien supermarket story or not, the fact that multiple remote viewers independently saw structures on the far side, that's not something you casually dismiss.
AJ from the Y-Files was on, and he was the one that was telling us that there's photos, right, of the dark side of the moon, that someone had seen photos and was assuming that these would be released shortly, that there were structures. Wow, this is going to be the biggest news ever, and then it was never released.
Are you talking about maybe Carl Wolf?
Is that what it was?
Who was taken to, this is all his claims, and he died in a freakish bike accident a little after saying this. But he said that there was like in like Langley, Virginia, where a lot of spooky stuff goes on. He was taken to some it was like inside a mountain complex, which we definitely, Carl Wolf, yeah.
That guy bikes?
Yeah, apparently not enough.
That guy could die any time.
Oh, man.
On a scooter. So, photographs of the 1966 lunar orbiter mission that revealed large base of the moon. Can we hear what he's saying?
Scan one section of the moon, then another, and then they would get a larger image. So this mosaic then would be put in that contact printer, and that was then a print that was issued to whomever, the press, the scientist, whatever, wherever that was intended to go. So he was showing me how all this worked, and we walked over to one side of the lab, and he said, by the way, we've discovered a base on the back side of the moon.
Carl Wolf's story was publicly shared at the Disclosure Project in 2001. He swore he saw base images in a secure military facility. Decades later, he's hit and killed while cycling, just after restating his claims. Even if it's coincidence, the pattern of whistleblowers dying shortly after revealing classified info is concerning, especially when the photos still haven't surfaced.
And then he pulled out one of these mosaics and showed this base, which had geometric shapes. There were towers, there were spherical buildings, there were very tall towers and things that looked somewhat like radar dishes, but they were large structures. I didn't say any more to him because I was concerned again that somebody was going to come in at any moment, would catch us having this conversation, and we would be in real trouble. I realized that he was telling me this information because he didn't have anybody else to talk to. Every day that I went home, I would think to myself, I can't wait to hear about this on the news, And, so I'd turn on the TV and I'd look at the news to see if they're going to announce, we've discovered a base on the backside of the moon, being really naive, And of course, here it is 30-some years later, and we still haven't heard about it.
This is the quiet burden of disclosure. People see something extraordinary, but the world isn't ready or willing to hear it. Carl wasn't trying to go public. He just needed to tell someone. That's the story you hear over and over again in this field. Not grandstanding, just isolation.
But then there's the question of disinformation, right? You could conceivably give people a bunch of nonsense and tell them about it, knowing that some of it is going to leak, and and it won't be verified, and it's going to make this whole story seem even more ridiculous and make people less likely or reluctant to study it.
Government operatives know the best way to hide truth isn't to bury it. It's to flood the room with noise, fake documents, sketchy witnesses, impossible stories. All of it blurs the line between reality and fiction until nobody trusts anything. And if there was a base on the moon, would we even believe it? After unraveling the theories about alien bases hiding on the moon's far side, you'd think we'd come back to Earth for some clarity. But no, the weirdness only multiplies. Are crop circles a message or a mask? In episode 2327, Joe Rogan and AJ Gentile dive into one of the strangest and most overlooked conspiracy topics, crop circles. At first glance, the phenomenon seems like an obvious hoax. But as the episode unfolds, they explore the baffling physical evidence, and government interference that suggests something much deeper might be going on. What starts as a conversation about pranksters with boards turns into a breakdown of electromagnetic anomalies, impossible fractal patterns, and a 400-year-old mystery that's never been solved.
And I also wanted to find the other side, so that what we're left with is some truth. And not all stories can be fully debunked. And I've had my mind flipped a couple of times. You know, crop circles, hollow moons, some really crazy shit have flipped me around.
Crop circles is a weird one.
So weird.
It's a weird one because when I first saw them, I'm like, what is that? And then I saw that these guys were doing them with boards and string. I was like, oh, it's just people being silly. And then I watched a whole documentary about how the energy that bent these things over caused these nodes to explode as if they'd been cooked in a microwave.
Correct.
I'm like, what? And then you find out that the actual stalks are woven together.
This is where things start to get weird. Most people assume crop circles are just some farmers getting pranked, but there are physical anomalies in some formations that don't line up with hoaxes, like stalks bending at microwave-like angles or being woven instead of snapped. Even skeptics admit there's a fraction of cases that remain unexplained.
That these are complex geometric designs that would have taken people weeks to map out. And there's no footprints leading up to it. There's no roads, no machinery, no evidence of any use of any kind of machinery. And these things appear like that. Like people have flown over an area and then flown back an hour or two later, and there's immense football field size, perfect geometry that no one can explain how it was created.
Correct. So the nodes in the stalks, the node is like a knuckle on your fingers. So those are there for phototropism, to bend toward light. So what you're talking about is these things are bent over. They're bent over at right angles. It can only be done with high energy.
Some circles are mathematically complex and appear overnight without any trace of human interference. The nodes in the stalks are literally warped, as if from intense heat, not physical pressure, and that alone separates the real ones from man-made fakes.
But also around these crop circles, they're finding microscopic metallic spheroids in around the circles. And that's not a conspiracy theory. They're finding them. And there are these magnetic fields around the circles. And you can see videos online of people going into these crop circles and their hands start to get red. Things are happening to them. So I went into crop circles thinking it was all guys with boards.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you watch people with boards making a crop circle, it's a mess. They can't do this. And you cannot bend the nodes of reeds and weave them together in a perfect... You can't do it. So that was, as I'm doing the research, I'm like, all right, 99% of them are fake, but there's this 1% that I cannot explain.
Metallic particles and measurable magnetic anomalies aren't things you expect from pranksters. It raises the possibility that something, or someone, with access to advanced tech is leaving these patterns for a reason. And if 1% defies explanation, that's still hundreds of mysterious events.